Hello, biologists. Michelle Glass here, and our job for today is to do two videos over the urinary system and the reproductive system. So let's get started. All right, so in this first video, we're going to be focusing on the excretory or urinary system. And as we know, our focus in the lab is primarily on the human as our example species to look at. So as we study the human excretory system, we can trace the pathway of the urine through the kidney. So the kidney is the organ where urine is produced. And what we see is that this process begins in a special set of capillaries that's referred to as the glomerulus. So what we see is waste material, metabolic waste material, is filtered out of the bloodstream at that capillary bed, the glomerulus. And then that filtrate moves through a special tube called the nephron. And we can also call these like collectively kidney tubules. So we'll see that in some of our labeling. Now the nephron itself is made up of different regions, and you have different actions taking place at each of those regions. So as the filtrate moves through the nephron, we'll see that it moves first through the proximal convoluted tubule. Then it moves through the descending loop of Henle, or we can call it the descending nephron loop. So loop of Henle is my default because that's what I learned, but we can just call it the nephron loop. And then it's going to move up the ascending nephron loop and then into what's called the distal convoluted tubule. So let's take just a minute here and look at our terms. So the term convoluted, my definition of the word convoluted, this is according to Michelle Glass, is twisty-turny, like this. Okay, and actually in our labeling, that term convoluted has been omitted, and you'll see it's just referred to as the proximal tubule. So you may be seeing that in your lecture materials as well. I'm going to go ahead and use the full name here, proximal convoluted tubule. And then as we look at the descending nephron loop and the ascending nephron loop, then we can imagine this is part of a loop. So you can also see that it's going to be a down and then an up. And so that would be the nephron loop. And then we'll have what's called a distal convoluted tubule. And again, the term convoluted is like twisty-turny. Okay, once that fluid makes it to the distal convoluted tubule, it will move into what is called the collecting duct. The collecting duct empties into what's called the minor calyx. Minor calyxes would be plural, filter into what are called major calyxes. That would be the plural form of the word. So from a minor calyx, it moves into the major calyx. The major calyx then empties into the renal pelvis, and then renal pelvis empties into the ureter, and so now we have left the kidney. So from the kidney, the fluid flows into the ureter. From the ureter, the urine flows into the urinary bladder, which is basically where that urine is being stored. And then to leave the bladder, the urine will exit through the urethra and the urethra opening. In some instances, we'll see that the urethra is shared by the reproductive system, and in others, we'll see that the urinary and reproductive systems are completely separate. Okay, so coming up next, we are going to do some labeling. So pull out those lab manuals so you can make some labeling notes. Okay, biologists. So we are looking here at the human abdominopelvic cavity, focusing in mostly on the pelvic cavity, which is the lower portion. And what we want to be able to do here is label some of our urinary system structures. So let's begin with the kidney. We do have a left and a right kidney. And the kidney, remember, is the structure where the urine is being produced. The urine then flows into a tube called the ureter, which we can see here in this kind of off-white color, and then the ureters carry the urine into the urinary bladder where it is stored. We can also see that you have blood vessels moving into the kidney. So remember, any blood vessels shown here in red are going to be arteries. So this is called the renal artery, which we can see on both sides. And then the blue vessels that we can see here and here will be called the renal veins. Moving to our next image, we're looking here at our kidney kind of cut open. And here we can start on the outside with what is called the, let me change my color a little bit, try to help that out. I think blue will work. Renal capsule. So anything renal, you should think of as referring to kidney. Then we have this outer portion of the kidney, and we're going to call it the renal cortex. So I think we've introduced the term cortex as your outermost layers, how I'm going to define this. And then we have a medulla, which we can think of as the innermost tissue layer. And so the renal medulla is going to be represented here. And what we actually see is that the renal medulla is made up of these sort of triangular pieces, which we call renal pyramids. So all of these sort of triangular pieces are renal pyramids, and collectively all of the renal pyramids here make up the renal medulla. Kind of the point of each renal pyramid we will call the renal papilla. So you can see that with each one of these renal pyramids. Now we have extending in both the cortex and into the medulla this yellow colored tubing here. And so all of this yellow colored tubing that we see here, we can call renal tubules. And the term tubule is sort of like tiny tube. Now to make my labels a little bit easier to deal with, I'm going to erase where I outlined all of the tubules, and I'm going to erase where I outlined the pyramid there. So I'll do this arrow here to represent all of that yellow is referred to as the renal tubule. Now what we can see, try to zoom in a little bit. Won't work. Okay, sorry about that. What we can see is this sort of like dot right here. I drew right on top of it. You see that little like ball? That's going to be our glomerulus. Our glomerulus is actually inside, so we're not properly seeing the glomerulus from this particular image. From that little ball, the tube coming directly off of that is going to be called the proximal convoluted tubule. Now remember, in our lab manual, it's actually just listed as proximal tubule, so you can use that terminology if you'd like. If you trace from the glomerulus, the proximal convoluted tubule goes down. And where it goes down We're going to call that the descending let me try black. Hopefully that will show up a little better. Descending nephron loop. And then the loop comes down and then it goes back up. And so where it goes back up, we would call that ascending nephron loop. And so clearly anywhere we have the loop, so I'll trace it down, right? Anywhere we have the loop, that is going to be the nephron loop. So the nephron loop has a down and an up, a descending and an ascending. The ascending then meets up with right here, what would be called the distal convoluted, which you can omit that word if you want, tubule. And then this larger yellow tubule here is the collecting duct. So let me do my laser. So we see right here is the glomerulus. That's where the glomerulus is located. And from the glomerulus, you see the nephron makes this kind of circle, and that's proximal convoluted tubule. And then the loop goes down. So that's our descending nephron loop. And then the loop goes up. So that's our ascending nephron loop. And then it connects to the distal convoluted tubule. Distal convoluted tubule feeds right into the collecting duct right here. From there, we see that the urine is going to flow into what is called the minor calyx. So let's go back to doing our labels. So we can call this the minor calyx. All of these here would be minor calyx. So calyxes would be the plural form of the word. Where you have maybe multiple minor calyxes filtering into one opening, you would call that the major calyx. And so where you would have several major calyxes filtering into one space here, we call this the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis then flows directly into the ureter. So we can see that here. The ureter then, of course, goes on to the bladder. Also in this diagram, we can see the renal artery. So blood is moving away from the heart into the kidney, and we see that it's shown in red. And then here we have the renal vein, which remember would be shown in blue. So renal vein is in blue, and the renal artery would be shown in red, which is pretty easy to see there. Okay, so for the human excretory system, you should be able to trace the flow of urine from beginning all the way out of the body, and then you should be able to label these structures of both the urinary system as a whole and the kidney in particular. Stay tuned for our video on reproductive system.